peace negotiator with the Afghan Taliban. Minister Bilal Azhar Kayani, who's the Federal Minister of State for Finance and Revenue. And last but not least, Patricia Gossman, Associate Director, Asia Division of the Human Rights Watch. क्योंकि ये अफ़गान ख़वातीन और लड़कियों के बारे में पैनल है, what I would want as the starting point is to speak to somebody I had the great privilege of meeting in Kabul when she was the Deputy Speaker of the Afghan Parliament. And so she's best equipped to tell us. She was there when the Taliban were ousted. She was a part of the new governance structures put in place in Afghanistan, representative structures, and she was there when the Taliban came back. Ms. Koofi also has played a role as a negotiator with a peace negotiator with the Afghan Taliban. So Fawzia, I'm going to ask you, I saw myself, we had an office since January of 2002 in Afghanistan, and you were there all that time. What did you see after the Taliban downfall with regards to the status of women and girls in Afghanistan? I just remember a few statistics. Half of all civil servants are women, the number of girls going to school, the number of women who were working, the number of women in parliament. That in itself, I think, made a difference to hear women's voices. But tell us, what were the changes you saw after the Taliban were ousted? And then we can go on to speak about what happened when the Taliban made a comeback.
Good morning, everyone. I wanted to thank the organizers for organizing a very vibrant and timely space for conversation. Thank you, Samina. It's a pleasure to see you again, not in Afghanistan, but hopefully soon. This topic of women rights in Afghanistan and human rights in Afghanistan probably is the most political topic. In many occasions, they say human rights is not a political issue. I think nowadays human rights is one of the most political discussion globally, and this is very true in the case of Afghanistan, both in terms of the weaponization of women rights and human rights, but also in terms of sometimes using it as a bargaining chip when it comes to diplomacy and political trading off. Yes, and also in the case of Afghanistan, when we would like to assess the situation of human rights and women's situation, we always look at it from the time that the Taliban took control of Afghanistan in 1996 and then 2001. While the life and struggle of women in Afghanistan did not start from then. Historically, a woman in Afghanistan has always had a space in our civic and political environment. In fact, if I give you some figures, probably for some of, especially our Western diplomats, this might be, a new thing that women in Afghanistan had the right to vote before women in Switzerland did. Women in Afghanistan started to be medical doctors and nurses at the same time when women in Turkey started. And I think why we came to this point is a different discussion. I don't want to mix it, but just briefly, I think women in our region are the victim of mainly the Cold War. When the Cold War started, millions of dollars were invested in defeating the USSR through the different mujahideen groups without any benchmarks of indicators of situation of women and human rights. As a result, that money was spent and the society became radicalized. And I have seen that at least in my country. Now, speaking on the situation of women in Afghanistan, we all remember when President Bush announced the Operations Enduring Freedom in 2001, October 2001, he said, we are in Afghanistan to free its women and to help the people of Afghanistan fulfill their democratic rights. Of course, we believe that. We thought we are in this path together. Women were back to school. I was part of that campaign to send hundreds of thousands of female students back to school. Women were free to exercise their rights in the parliament. You're right, we had 25% female parliamentarians, 30% women in civil service, including also in the police and army, women in the villages. I think one of the changes that I could see the difference between now and the time when Afghanistan was occupied by USSR was the fact that women in the villages were also engaged. I remember traveling to a village once for my campaign in a mountainous area in my constituents, Badakhshan. A woman told me that, so Ms. Koofi, who is going to be the next president of United States? Is it going to be Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama? And I was like, how do you even follow this? So this indicates that the society was a vibrant society engaged from the local communities. Not only changes were imposed in the constitution, which was one of the most democratic constitutions. I think everything started to fall apart when the Iraq war started. When the Iraq war started, the focus went from Afghanistan to Iraq, and this was the time that the Taliban started re-emerging. And of course, then they were given the space, the office in Doha. And we knew from that time that any possible peace process or reconciliation, women's rights will be the first to be traded off. That's why we wanted to be part of the peace process, and we wanted to have a peace with justice, because it's true that silencing the gun is not peace. Peace is beyond that, and unfortunately we saw with the return of Taliban and the negotiation of Americans with Taliban emboldened them. As a result, today we see that not only democracy, I wouldn't say fail, but we failed democracy in Afghanistan, but also I think the whole global structure is affected by this. The United States global leadership is being questioned in many occasions because, if you go back to what the United States leaders said, we are there to support women's rights and liberate Afghan women, to a point when we actually question one of their special envoy. I would like to name him Ambassador Khalilzad. And I said, in your Doha negotiation with the Taliban, there is no one word of human rights and women's rights. His response was that we're not going to kill American soldiers to protect Afghan women's rights. It looked very hypocritical for me, because from a time there where they were there to liberate Afghan women to a point where they were not there to protect Afghan women's rights, and it became all of a sudden an internal issue, because they said women's rights in Afghanistan is an internal issue. You need to deal with it yourself. So we feel we have been weaponized. Our rights are weaponized, but I'm coming to that in the second part of your question.
You made some very important points, that when the decision was taken to withdraw from Afghanistan and the negotiations started with the Taliban in Doha, then all the pledges that had been made once the intervention took place, that women's rights and the rights of girls would be protected and advanced, they fell by the wayside. But in your own role as one of the peace negotiators, do you think that the Taliban representatives understood the importance of listening to women's voices? Or did they think they were going to get what they wanted and there was no need to make any compromise?
Yes, I was one of those engaged in negotiation with the Taliban. I think in any peace process, there are parties to peace. And these parties are mainly the ones who are part of the war. Everybody must be included and listened to in a peace process, and especially the ones that are concerned. In the case of Afghanistan, the architecture of peace process was made in a very interesting way. So the parties to the war were Afghan government, the Taliban, and an international community led by ISAF or NATO. However, when the peace started, from the time the peace process or the negotiation with the Taliban started, all the way from 2009, there were off-the-record meetings, but from 2011, when the Office for Taliban in Doha started, Afghan government was not meaningfully included. Well, now I was a political opposition. I had my own points of view about the way the Afghan government was run. I was a strong critic of, the power being centralized by few individuals. I had my points of view about corruption, but these are part of any democracy. I was listening to the speeches yesterday here. Every speaker was very bold and vocal on the way the Pakistan government runs. They had their points of view, but that doesn't mean that we should actually make the government collapse. So the government had its own problems, but they were mainly bypassed by its international allies and ignored. There are no official data of how many Afghan troops were killed, but there are indications that, that between 60 to 70,000 Afghan troops were killed. Now, when some world leaders say that, 3,000 NATO soldiers were killed, our sympathy and, we share the pain of those lost lives in Afghanistan. But Afghans were the main ones who actually lost everything. Not only their lives, but also their rights. So 60 to 70,000 military personnel, hundreds of thousands of civilians were killed in the last 20 years. But the same people were ignored. When the Americans started negotiation, they went directly engaged with the Taliban because they wanted to talk their own issues. And that was a process of weakening the institutions in Afghanistan. So the collapse did not happen on the 15th of August itself. It was a process that led to 15th of August. When we started the negotiation on the 12th of September 2020, it was too late because I was involved with the Taliban in Moscow when we were involved in dialogue with them. And then the Taliban wanted to have the deal signed with Americans. So they were absolutely different group of Taliban. They were more approachable, they were welcoming, they were open. In fact, it's on the record that they said, from their perspective, women can go to school, university, get PhD, get to public. The only position they cannot get is to be a president or head of state, which is something that is, even the Islamic clerks do not have a common position on that. It's something to be debated. But from the Taliban perspective, the only thing that women cannot do is to be the head of state. Everything else women are allowed to do. This is before they signed the agreement. When they signed the agreement on the 29th of February 2020, and we went to talk to them in September, this was the first moment I realized the Taliban are changed. They have signed the deal with Americans. They think they are, they are the winner anyways. So they were not serious in the negotiation, not only on women's rights, but on everything else. But probably you might ask me the question, why did you stay in the negotiation if the Taliban were not serious? Well, we continued to engage because, first of all, we were blamed for playing the spoiler role. If we left the negotiation table, probably we would have been even more blamed for the consequences of that. But I think the process of failing Afghanistan and the government started way beyond 15th of August, when Americans directly started, not only talking with the Taliban, but also bypassing their European allies. We all remember 15th of August when thousands of people went to the airport and only American Marines were allowed to allow people, had the power to allow people enter the airport, no Europeans. And this was when I went to Europe and I said to the Europeans that you need to have your own independent security-focused foreign policy. I'm not here to talk about Europe, but what I'm trying to say is, multilateralism, accountability, mutual accountability, all the claims that we have made the people of our part of the world believe in that. I think it all started to fall apart when the structure in Afghanistan fell.
Thank you so much, Fawzia. I think that gives us a sense of why is it that negotiating with the Taliban didn't produce any results? Richard, you have covered Afghanistan for so long. We met, at least 15 years ago in Afghanistan, but you continued to cover it after the Taliban takeover, and you have, quite obviously, the topic here, engaging with the Taliban or holding them accountable. In your engagement, I believe you can't go there anymore, but in your engagement with the Taliban, did you see any opportunities, any response on their part to all the concerns that we have about the rights of women and girls in Afghanistan? So first, could you tell us exactly what the situation is on the ground in terms of the situation of human rights, but specifically in the context of women and girls? And second, were there any, or are there any opportunities for constructive engagement with the Taliban? If they aren't, how can they be held accountable? Please, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Samina. It's great to be on a panel moderated by you after many years. I'd also like to thank the organizers for arranging a panel on the situation in Afghanistan. It's not obvious that at the Asma Jahangir conference that should be the case, but the interest is very clear from the numbers who've come, and with certainly good judgment, I think, by the organizers. A pleasure to be here. Maybe I will start with the second part of the question first, if you don't mind. When I was appointed I started in May 22, and I went on three visits to Afghanistan, and indeed you're right, I am familiar with the country. I started going and living in Afghanistan from 2003. And at the beginning, the Taliban were quite engaged with me, willing to meet me, did not put restrictions on where I should travel, and I was able to go to Kandahar, to Mazar-e-Sharif, to Panjshir, to Bamiyan, to travel around the country, for example. So they were interested in engaging, but I was always a bit conscious that it was a kind of honeymoon period. They were testing me out to see what they may be able to get, because they had an agenda in that they did not completely dismiss human rights, so that was a good thing, but they wanted themselves to be seen as the victims of human rights, not as the perpetrators of human rights violations. And secondly, they were keen to point out double standards, that if they were going to be held accountable, they expected others to be held accountable too. In fact, it was rather not even that far. It was others should be held accountable, not us, because we were fighting a jihad. Everything we did was justified. And they went close to saying that the fact that we succeeded against all the odds, against the most powerful military in the world, tells us that we are blessed, that we were, in fact, we could not have won this war, and they see themselves as victorious, unless they were on the right side of Allah. So that was the kind of positioning. So some opening, but very much on their terms. And then that changed. I started making reports, and I write quite a lot of reports. On my 12th report now. I've tabled 11 in the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly. And when they started seeing my reports and public statements, and also seeing that the civil society and the resilience, particularly of women in civil society, was more or less agreeing with what I was reporting, that created a problem. And particularly around the rights of women and girls, also around minorities. These were the two issues that they found, they even told me, they found sensitive. And they even said, they gave a warning to me, kind of, please lay off those issues. And of course, I can't do that. And then they got increasingly less engaged with me, and finally said that they wouldn't issue me a visa. So that's the kind of history of the trajectory. I'm still very hopeful, and I still engage with them. And every time I'm going to research a subject, I tell them, I send questions to them. I share draft reports for their comments. Member states present may be interested to know that I share my draft reports with the Taliban with the de facto authorities before I share them with you. So I'm still treating them seriously and with respect. On the second question, I think most people here will know generally the trajectory of human rights over the last 4.5 years now, and it's great that Fawzia has covered some of the history, in particular, the history of women's rights in Afghanistan, and especially the process. I'm not sure we can call it a peace process, but the political process that led to the takeover by the Taliban. Some people say collapse of the republic. I don't like to say that; it's a bit negative. But the takeover by the Taliban. So I think on that we have seen a step-by-step, an incremental tightening of the grip. And the tightening of the grip, I think a good litmus test is where human rights have been stepped back. They were not stepped back immediately. An example would be that, I'll use this example because it's well known, that education for girls was suspended quite soon after they took over, but only suspended. And they said it's only for a short period until we can make the conditions safe, suitable and safe for girls to come back to school above 6th grade. It's only suspended to 6th grade. And then nothing happened, except that a little bit of time later, about a year later, universities closed. And then a year after that, they had an exception that universities closed, but women could still study medicine. Now then that closed. So it was step by step. And a bit after that, we've seen, and I'll just mention two particular, the Taliban call them laws, but one was the law on the propagation of virtue and the prevention of vice in August 2024, which was definitely really clamped down, especially on women and girls' rights. And then this year, just this month actually, or in January, I think it was January 4th, the introduction of a new code on the regulation on the procedure of the courts was introduced, which also is causing a lot of concerns, not only for women and girls, but also for other groups, including, well, everyone, but including ethnic and religious and other minorities particularly. So it's been incremental tightening of the grip. When it comes to accountability, maybe I'll do that in the second question. So I would like to talk a little bit about accountability, but I realized I've talked for a while, so back to you, Samina.
Thank you. We'll get back to the issue of accountability, but I'd like to actually ask Patricia who has worked for a very long time on the rights crises, multiple rights crises in Afghanistan. Um, when we're looking at what's happening in Afghanistan, um, women more isolated than they were in the past, partly because, as Ms. Koofi pointed out, is there are now more restrictions even on the kind of engagement that women had uh, in terms of social mobility, economic opportunities, political rights. I think we can pretty much write off at the moment. You know, the topic of today's discussion was engaging with the Taliban or holding them accountable. In your understanding, you know, with your deep knowledge of the dynamics within Afghanistan, do you think this is an either or issue, or do you think there are opportunities that exist and aren't being exploited, or do you think that the Taliban need to be held accountable, and if so, how?
Thank you, Samina, and thanks everyone here for the conference. It's really a privilege and an honor to be here and to be with my panelists this morning. Well, what first struck me when I was told the topic for this panel was the kind of binary framework that was provided. I don't think such binary frameworks really work well in Afghanistan. And what I'd like to do, actually, to get into that, is to tell a bit of an account about Asma Jahangir's work on Afghanistan, which I think really kind of reveals why that kind of binary isn't really very helpful to understand why we continue to see this kind of level of crisis, human rights crisis in Afghanistan. Now, as all of you may know, Asma was the special rapporteur on extrajudicial summary and arbitrary executions from, I think, 98 to 2004 or so. And I met her many times in that period. And we discussed Afghanistan quite a few times. And then after the US invasion, in the early period of 2002, she made an official visit to Afghanistan. So this would be in the first half of 2002, sometime around the period where the interim administration had been set up. And she came back. She spent her time there meeting with a vast, sort of diverse group of activists. The Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission had just been set up. It was early days still for any of the kind of institution building we hoped to see. But she had a lot of interaction with people who'd been concerned about human rights for a long time in Afghanistan. And when she came back, she produced a report that was issued in October of 2002. And what it called for, well, first of all, it reflected those views. And the main theme that came out from her meetings and her reflections on what people had told her in Afghanistan was a concern about entrenched impunity. People had just seen the return, in this case, of Northern Alliance figures in the new government, allies of the US in their fight against the Taliban, now becoming part of the new administration. And there was a lot of concern then about what this would mean and the impunity that prevailed and had prevailed since the very beginning of the war in Afghanistan. So she, in her report, called for a commission of inquiry to be established to look into even the past in Afghanistan, to lay out these reasons for these continuing kind of cycles. Afghanistan's war is kind of a layering. You have the coup in 78, Soviet invasion, and the rest. And with each layer, it was a perpetuation of more abuses of slightly different kinds, but the irony is that everybody comes to power saying they're going to restore security, they're going to provide justice, whether it's an end to feudalism, restoration of Islamic values, bring stability, and so on. But it always ended up with just another layer of serious human rights violations and war crimes. So her suggestion was to have this commission inquiry and launch a real effort to try to understand these patterns. Well, of course, this was shut down immediately. The US was just embarking on its major military campaign in Afghanistan, which included things like extraordinary renditions and torture and CIA black sites. And the last thing they were going to support was any kind of scrutiny about their behavior. And Lakhdar Brahimi, who was the special representative, was also completely opposed to this, saying that it would rock the boat at a time when it was necessary to begin to provide, some level of peace and security. Well, we all know how that turned out. The next sort of effort in this part was also Asma's idea, which was to have a mapping report, again, to lay out through already published sources what had happened in Afghanistan. From the Taliban, all the way back to, again, the beginnings of the war. And that report was written using the passive voice there. I was one of the authors of that report, full disclosure. But the UN refused to publish it because they got cold feet. And then, as we all may know, the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission did its own effort, again, trying to look at all these patterns, that there wasn't just one perpetrator in all this. It was a series of perpetrators. So this is what I mean, the either-or thing doesn't really work very well in Afghanistan. And this was a tremendous effort. At some point, somebody should write a book about the process. They went, the researchers for the commission went to all over Afghanistan, every province, multiple districts, gathering testimonies and stories about what had happened, again, since the late 70s up through, through about 2000, early 2000s. And it was extraordinary, partly for the effect it had on the researchers themselves. As one of the commissioners involved in that told me, people came back for the first time hearing from other researchers what had happened in different parts of the country. Because how it goes, everybody knows what happens at home, to your family, to your community, to your district. And those are your views of the war. But in this case, they were hearing from others, different periods of time, different districts, different ethnic groups and what they experienced. And it was a revelation for many of them. This is what I was told, that they realized first the magnitude of the suffering and how there was a shared narrative of it. Unfortunately, that report has also never been published. President Karzai dismissed the commissioners who were in charge of it. President Ghani had no interest in it. And the US, of course, adamantly opposed it being released. So, it's been time after time this has happened. In fact, again, this gets into the either-or question. I was recently part of a conversation about whether that report should be released now. And again, it covers everyone. There's no excluding or no kind of privileging one group. It's trying to tell the story of all the different periods of the war. And somebody who spoke at that meeting expressed some caution about releasing it, because he said, if you release it now, the Taliban will use it to show that they're not the only ones. And as if that would be a bad thing. I thought, well, that's actually really important to know, that it didn't just start now. It didn't start with 2021. And the failure to understand that makes it very unlikely that you reach some kind of way of overcoming this and really achieving some kind of justice in the long run. Because instead, people want to close off and be very selective in their view of who is really responsible for the crisis that Afghanistan is in. So, we look, again, there's a bit of nostalgia, which is understandable, and looking back at the past and saying, well, things were so much better then. Well, they weren't for a lot of Afghans. Every year as the war ground on, it got worse. And it got worse for Afghans in many parts of the country who were in the battlefield areas and experiencing the full brunt of the war. And what led up to the withdrawal was happening for a very long period of time of, also crumbling institutions, massive corruption, all the things that we know, but have sort of buried away now. And they should be scrutinized again. What went wrong, why we are where we are today, and how to hold all of those who bear responsibility for these abuses accountable are the real questions we should be asking. Just one last note on that. In this regard, there was an extraordinary event that happened last October. again, sort of echoes of what Ahmed tried to achieve, was the UN Human Rights Council adopted a resolution establishing an independent mechanism on Afghanistan to gather evidence of war crimes, human rights abuses, going all the way back in the past again. They were determined that this should be comprehensive. And this was a very, I have utter admiration for the human rights groups that pushed this through. It was about 100 different Afghan human rights groups and international organizations that supported this, against some formidable opposition coming, in some cases, from countries who had troops on the ground in Afghanistan and did not want this kind of scrutiny, once again. But with backing from the EU, the resolution passed and the mechanism is going to be established. Now, many questions remain. Will it get funding? What will the staffing be right? But it's the first time we're seeing, overcoming those obstacles to say, yes, we need scrutiny on every actor that played a part in this tragedy in Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patty. I think it's important for us to understand the entire picture as opposed to one piece of the challenge that women and girls face in Afghanistan. Yes, governance issues were a problem. Yes, abuses were common. We all know the support that was given to warlords in many parts of Afghanistan for strategic reasons. But given where we are at the moment, with a Taliban regime that is deeply entrenched, faces very little opposition to its rule in military terms, not in terms of civil society, not in terms of what women and girls would want, or in fact, most Afghans whose voice is not heard. Where do we stand then? Mr. Kayani, we've had any number of issues that we've raised, and I think all of them very important. But what we haven't got here is the context of the Pakistan government. I know that I follow Pakistan government policy very closely, and the number of times that Pakistani high officials have raised the issue of the Taliban's need to have an inclusive government, to respect the rights of women and girls. And indeed, since the Taliban takeover, attempts made to engage with the Taliban so that, they become more of a member of the wider community as opposed to isolated with their own versions of governance that do not find acceptability even within their own country, let alone elsewhere. So all these efforts that have been made to engage with the Afghan Taliban by the Pakistan government, the repeated concerns expressed by Islamabad, have they had any impact on Taliban thinking or Taliban policies? And if they haven't, Patty raised the issue of it's not an either or. Does this mean that Pakistan should then say, well, we'll write them off, we can't engage with them, or continue to engage with them in the hopes that they will see some change in Taliban policy? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Samina. I'm grateful to the conference organizers for the invitation and to be on this esteemed panel today. It's a very relevant question. It's a very relevant question for the government. So I'm grateful for that. I think let's start by really discussing whether engagement has been given a fair chance. And I think that the government is very confident in saying that we believe peace and diplomacy have been given every possible chance, especially of late. If you go back all the way to 2020, way before Pakistan's engagement with the Taliban, you go back to the Doha Accords in 2020. At that time, even back then, before the Taliban takeover, there were two things that were agreed in writing, that Afghan soil will not be used to threaten the security of other countries, and that an inclusive political process will be carried out. These were written commitments which were repeated again and again. And on the basis of that, prisoners were also released who were supposed to then become, integrate into society. But we feel that those 5,000 prisoners, I believe, all or the most of them that could, all went back to joining militant operations that were going on. In 2023, again, there was a Pak, China, Afghanistan trilateral, where there were counterterrorism commitments. And then last year, in 2025, we've had 3 visits of the Deputy Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister, to Afghanistan, other high-level delegation visits. We've all seen the Doha dialogues, the negotiations in Istanbul. And we have seen, after all of these efforts, where Pakistan has made real efforts to try and get the Taliban regime to sit down and really agree to a credible and verifiable mechanism to stop the cross-border terrorism, we've seen them fail, because there is it always starts with a discussion or an agreement, broadly speaking, but when it comes down to thrashing out a credible and verifiable mechanism based on information, specific information that Pakistan has provided, we feel that, and this has been now a tried and tested experience, that the Taliban regime then backtracks and is not willing to commit. We don't think this is a case of lack of capacity. We don't think that this is a failure of diplomacy. We believe that this is a clear lack of intent on the part of the Taliban regime, and in fact, a clarity of intent to continue supporting terrorist activity in Pakistan, whether it's through the TTP or whether it's through the BLA. Pakistan has provided information on 58 sites across Afghanistan, which are being used by the TTP and the BLA, and we feel that nothing has been done. We know that the TTP leader is housed and kept in Kabul and given a monthly stipend, and yet nothing is done. We know that terrorists who cross the border and carry out terrorist activities here in their thousands are given safe passage and are facilitated. So when, as a state, we know that we are battling terrorism, especially in the provinces of KP and Balochistan, and every day our own soldiers, our own law enforcement officials are dying in battle trying to protect us. And we know that the source is the stream from across the border, including safe havens and financial facilitation and safe passage. And when you speak to that party, which is the Afghan Taliban regime, with evidence that this needs to stop, and then when we see that all efforts to get them to agree to a credible and verifiable mechanism to stop it have failed, then any government, any state has no choice but to do whatever is necessary to protect itself. So right now, this is where we are at, and I think it's sad. And we all were hoping, and I think the government of Pakistan, the state of Pakistan, has left no stone unturned in that effort to try and ensure that we could have had an outcome. But I believe that we've now realized more than ever that this has got nothing to do with the lack of capacity. It's a lack of intent. The TTP and the BLA are not the only terrorist organizations that are being given, provided safe havens in Afghanistan. We believe there are 20 such organizations, including Al-Qaeda, including ETIM. And so right now, this is where we are at. Does that mean that engagement in the future should not happen at all? I think that we would always want to explore any possibility that can result in a lasting peace. But I think that there would have to be very strong conditions. And I don't think that Pakistan can backtrack on any conditions that are necessary for us to protect ourselves and to ensure peace in Pakistan. Just to give you an idea of the scale and the specificity of the issue, just last year in 2025, of the 2,000 plus terrorists that were killed, 229 terrorists were identified Afghan citizens. These are only the ones that were identified. And then we have learned that these individuals, when they were killed and their bodies identified, ceremonies were held to celebrate them back in their hometowns. Local Taliban commanders participated in those ceremonies and those funerals. So when you see such brazen and blatant ownership of terrorism in Pakistan, the government has no choice but to do what is necessary. I've already mentioned the 58 sites. I've already mentioned that the TTP leaders that are being provided safe haven there. But you know, so we do realize that there is a human suffering that is going on in Afghanistan. We do believe that is also due to this Afghan Taliban regime, which is exporting its toxic and violent ideology. And we believe now, or I believe now more than ever, that it will not stop, because that is the basis for its existence. So I think that although we are totally cognizant of the humanitarian situation in Afghanistan, I don't think any government in the world has cared more for the Afghan citizens and their humanitarian needs. I think we are perhaps a unique example of a country that has opened its doors over 4 decades to millions of Afghans and given them all sorts of opportunities in this country. And that's something we take pride in as a country. We believe that, you know, any human suffering in any part of the world deserves basic human rights. And Pakistan has played its part to do that. But, you know, we believe that the Afghan Taliban regime is part of that problem. We've spoken, I think Richard just now mentioned the new penal code, where 4 categories of citizens have been created for different treatments for the same crime. Broadly, the scholars, the elites, the middle class, and the lower class. And similarly, I think a lot has rightly already been said about the situation of women's education and women's rights. You know, I'm pleased to be surrounded by people who have had extensive experience, who are definitely have more on-ground and practical experience, and hence more authority to speak on the subject. But speaking to other people who have also had first-hand experience, a phrase that I heard was that for women right now, it's either the home or the grave. And that's as sad a situation as one can have. You know, Pakistan, on its part, even now, is providing scholarships for females' education under the Allama Iqbal scholarship program. So we definitely understand that need. But at the same time, as I said, any future engagement, I think, has to be predicated on visible, verifiable, and irreversible actions, including you know, complete severance of ties with all terrorist organizations. That we believe there are 20, and especially 2 that relate to Pakistan. A credible and verifiable mechanism to dismantle terrorist sanctuaries and support networks. I've mentioned the 58 TTP sites that Pakistan has already mapped and identified in Afghanistan that the Taliban regime also knows about. Inclusion of women in society and the recognition of their rights. And an inclusive governance in Afghanistan based on the inclusive political process that was agreed back in 2020 in writing by the Taliban, and an unequivocal end to cross-border terrorism. So we believe that any engagement should be conditional on this. Now, even the aid that is currently going in there, we believe that it is going in there with the intent to alleviate the human suffering. However, there is a fear that is not what it may be used for right now. And whether that aid, whatever form it's going in right now, is in fact only facilitating further or strengthening the hand of the Taliban regime to continue to export terrorism. So in a nutshell, and I'll try and stop here, I think that peace and diplomacy have been given every possible chance. I think that any government, like the government of Pakistan, would do whatever is needed to protect itself, especially after having exhausted all diplomatic efforts. Having said that, in a nutshell, I think that future engagement cannot be ruled out, but has to be conditional and has to have very strong conditions which once and for all root out terrorism from Afghanistan being exported to Pakistan, and also includes a permanent solution to the human rights issues of Afghanistan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kayani. We've got a little time before we open up the session for questions. So if very, very briefly, Richard, Fawzia, the Minister, and Patty, if you could just say very briefly, what do you think should be the next steps taken to address the crisis of, well, pretty much women, girls, in particular, their rights in Afghanistan, given the fact that there are challenges to engagement and there are challenges to attempts to hold the Taliban accountable. So what would you say, very briefly, is your understanding? Where do the opportunities lie?
Thank you. Am I on? Yeah, try to be brief. Well, first of all, in relation to the question as the subject of this engagement or accountability, I agree with others, and I think Patty raised it, particularly that these kind of, it's not either or, this kind of binary framework doesn't work. It's not mutually exclusive that there should be engagement or accountability. There is no question about that there should be accountability from my point of view. For the Taliban, certainly, and especially for their violations against women and girls, but not only the Taliban, and in that I concur completely with Patty Gossman. Decades of impunity have led to a climate where there is no accountability, there are no consequences for wrongdoing, and therefore wrongdoing continues to be perpetrated. And breaking the cycle of violence requires comprehensive accountability for human rights violations and international crimes committed over many decades. Focusing only on the Taliban will lead to long-term grievances, in my view, and will not ensure peace, and might even undermine the prospect of a long-term durable solution. Justice must not be selective, it must be even-handed, and it must be consistent. Therefore, all parties to the, I think what Patty called layered conflicts in Afghanistan should be held to account. And that includes international actors in the region, and particularly those farther afield. And in that respect, the new accountability mechanism was established a few months ago in principle, it's not yet operational, that Patty Gossman's account led up to. However, while I think criminal accountability is necessary, it's not sufficient. It will take a lot of time. And victim-centered justice requires genuine inclusion of Afghans people in all their diversity, gender and in other ways, in all stages of the design of the project, implementation, design, implementation, and evaluation, and may include, or should include, non-criminal approaches, truth-seeking perhaps, or reparations, or memorialization are some examples. On the issue of opportunities for the step for the way forward. I think it's that engagement should continue, but it needs to be principled engagement, and that's a word that is a bit fluffy in my view. We need to tease out what does principled mean, and I think there are different elements of this. I think at the bottom it means engagement that does not normalize what is clearly unacceptable, which is in part the treatment of women and girls, but as the minister pointed out, the creation of different classes of people who we treated differently in a justice system is also unacceptable, and there's a whole list. In terms of possibilities for the way forward, it's being said that this current Doha process, I'll call it that, it's confusing because this is the past one and the current one, is the only game in town right now. That process is proceeding, but proceeding very tentatively, I would say. And I think that it would be interesting to see if there are other opportunities. I note that back in, I think it was 23, I lose track of time, there was an independent assessment which was requested by the Security Council. And the assessment called for a number of steps, but it put front and center into Afghan dialogue, including the diversity of Afghanistan's people. And it also called for human rights at the center of that, and for the appointment of a UN envoy and a contact group. Now, much of that has not happened, even though it was endorsed by the Security Council.
Thanks,
so I do
Richard.
think
We're
that
going
would
to
be
have
interesting.
to move on.
Yeah,
Otherwise
sorry,
we won't
I've talked
get
too much.
any-
I stopped
but
there.
Thank you. That was
So I think the situation of women and human rights in Afghanistan will not change if the political ecosystem and the political landscape does not change. And the political landscape is a question about how to deal with the current situation in terms of the Taliban. The very difficult but yet very easy question of engagement. I think there were a lot of attempts, and there is like a continued engagement with Taliban by different countries, different parties. But one thing is clear, that the Taliban are not trustworthy partner for engagement. Since 1993, Pakistan supported the Taliban, hosted them, provided sanctuary to the families, to the Taliban leaders, you know. But the moment they went to power, their policy shifted. And they are now providing sanctuary to the, you know, to the people that are a real threat to Pakistan, to TTP, to other violent extremism groups. The same with other countries. So I think the Taliban, being engaged with them, they do not have a policy or vision on the way they govern. They do not have a policy on economy, on you know, foreign policy, etc. Their policy is a theocratic-based government, which they claim it that this is according to the principles of Sharia based on Hanafi fiqh, which is actually in contradiction to what I'm a Hanafi Sunni, to what you know, the fiqh says, because recently, I mean, they have issued 220 edicts since they came to power. So, and 160 of them only limits women's rights. So their main agenda within the principles of Islam is how to eliminate and erase women's rights, starting from their fundamental rights to education, which is an Islamic rights to education. So they do not have a policy. Now, when you engage with them, what are the issues that you engage? And I think Pakistan approach towards Taliban, and now how they, you know, they are part of this regional rivalry and they are being used against Pakistan. It's just an example of, you know, how trustworthy they are. Taliban victory has inspired a lot of military violent extremism in the world, starting from Yemen, where now they started imposing some of these Taliban kind of restriction on women's rights, to, I understand I need to keep it very short, to Central Asian countries, in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, people are asking Pakistan, Islamic Emirate. They have inspired many violent extremism groups. Now, how to tackle that? I think the way forward is truly and meaningfully support a constitutional order in Afghanistan. And I think this time that should come from the region. Allow Afghans the space to talk about their own country, to talk genuinely what they think is best for their country. And that's why, we had our first round of dialogue in Islamabad end of September in Pakistan, although it wasn't easy for us, but also for Pakistanis as well to host that first round of dialogue, for us to have the space to talk meaningfully. This is a time we do not want our laws to be translated from French or English or Arabic or Urdu or I don't know, Hindi or whatever languages it is to our languages. This is a time we want our laws to be made by us. And I think only a democratic process in Afghanistan is in the interest of stability in Pakistan, in the region, and beyond. And I hope once there is a democratic process, Pakistan will seriously and genuinely stand by that.
I have to cut you off now because we do need to have, and there'll be a lot of interest in the audience as well for questions.
I forgot the issue of refugee, but I hope I will have the time.
You will have the time to raise it, Patty.
I'll keep it brief, without repeating some of the things Richard said on accountability. Just one of the things, when countries are engaging with the Taliban, we've consistently called for them to raise the issue of rights violations of women and girls. So close, okay. It is one issue which we've seen near universal consensus among countries condemning it, and that's very rare in the world today. So we'd like to keep that consensus on that condemnation intact. On engagement, though, one of the ironies, or one of the ways this is undercut, this message is undercut, when countries, of course, are engaging, and because it is their self-interest as states to do so. One thing they engage on is trying to return Afghan refugees and asylum seekers and migrants from Europe. And we've seen this even affect some girls and women. And this rather undercuts the message that we're trying to get consistency on of condemning the Taliban's abuses. So, with little hypocrisy in terms of governments engaging and still returning Afghan refugees. The other area which is great concern, I haven't seen much mention of it yet, is on aid. There's been a drastic cut in aid to Afghanistan in recent years, particularly with the cut of US aid earlier this year. And the effects have been particularly devastating for women and girls. Maternal health is plummeting. All the gains people like to talk about from the 20 years of the US occupation are being lost largely because the aid has just disappeared. So you've got child malnutrition rates also skyrocketing. And even in other areas which are also vital to women's rights and benefits is if you don't have electricity, then a girl trying to continue her education online can't do so. And you've got to think through exactly what aid cuts mean for the rights you're trying to preserve. We've mentioned the accountability mechanism. Two others are, of course, continued support for the International Criminal Court, which has issued arrest warrants against 2 Taliban leaders, and a case that may emerge at the International Court of Justice on Afghanistan's violations of the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. Okay, thank you.
And Minister West, since you will have the last word on the issue that Patty raised, which is on Afghan refugees, in particular, the policies that Pakistan has adopted, the impact on Afghan women, refugees and girls in Pakistan. Initially, the Pakistan government had said that exceptions would be made. It appears now that those exceptions aren't being made. So what would you say to that? How can Pakistan protect the rights of Afghan women and girls if it doesn't address the issue of Afghan refugees? But could you please, I'm sorry about this, keep it brief because I'm sure there's a lot of interest in terms of questions. Thank you.
Sure. So firstly, your question, I'll reiterate by saying that I think we should never forget the context of how hospitable Pakistan has been. I don't know of any other example in the world of the sort of hospitality that we have shown. And this is not a favor. This is something that we take pride in as people who recognize human suffering. And we are proud of having opened our arms over decades and having given economic opportunities and rights to our Afghan brothers and sisters. I think that, I mentioned, and I spoke at length regarding the continuous, facilitation and of terror to Pakistan. And when you have a situation like this, any country will have no option but to take whatever measures are necessary to bring peace to its land. And so when I've just given an example of 229 Afghan individuals or citizens alone in 2025 who were killed and identified terrorists, we have a serious problem. And we cannot afford to let our country bleed continuously again and again. So I think that the repatriation program that was started, it was done in a phased manner. I believe there were 3 categories. There were those with PORs, proof of registration, then the Afghan individuals with Afghan citizenship cards, and then the undocumented immigrants. And so I think the door does remain open, but the only condition was that we cannot, just like any country does not want undocumented citizens, especially when we are seeing a terrorism from that country. We wanted to repatriate them, which is what we are doing, but at the same time, with the chance to come legally to Pakistan, to obtain visas and come to Pakistan. I can always verify the number, but I believe that last year alone, 500,000 visas were issued to Afghan individuals. I've already mentioned that for women and girls especially, scholarships are still being issued to Afghan individuals by the government of Pakistan to facilitate education for both girls and boys. So we definitely believe and recognize the suffering of our Afghan brothers and sisters, and we continue to support humanitarian assistance there. We welcome Afghan individuals to Pakistan, but through a visa process, through a documented process, which is the need of not just Pakistan, given our circumstances with terrorism, but would be the need of any country, and we see other countries doing that. So we'll try and strike that balance. The only other thing I'll just add very quickly on the subject that was discussed by my fellow panelists in this round of questions is that I think Pakistan is doing whatever it can to hold the Taliban accountable, and after having engaged with them. And we believe that there has to be a credible and verifiable mechanism for dismantling terror networks in Afghanistan, and they should sever ties with terrorist organizations and ensure inclusion of women in society, ensure human rights. However, I think that the same perspective must be taken by the international community as well, and I think especially those that are providing aid there. That's not to say human aid should not go in. I think that any humanitarian aid which alleviates suffering of Afghan people, especially Afghan women, should take place. But I do think that it should be tied to ensuring these very outcomes. When there are 20 terrorist organizations operating out of Afghanistan, I think it's not just a problem for Pakistan; it's a problem for the region and for the world.
Thank you so very much, Minister, and to our panelists for a very wide-ranging and I think constructive discussion on not just what the situation is, but what's the way forward. So I'm going to open this up to the floor right now and then take questions. If you could just stand up so that I could, I think we have somebody here first. Yes, please go ahead, and then we'll move to you. Sir, you're on the list. Not to worry, you're next.
Thank you.
Please.
Thank you.
And could you identify yourself, please?
Okay. I'm Rukshandar Nas from Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. I'm working as a peace and human rights activist, and last more than 35 years I'm dealing with Afghan refugee women, particularly survivor of gender-based violence. I just want to raise two things because I want to take the opportunity of the federal government and the other representative from the international community. First of all, because the issue for us is the international community should take the responsibility of this entire supporting Taliban regimes in a different period, because not only women in Afghanistan, they are suffering, women from the both sides of the border, Balochistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, they are also suffering. The first thing, because in terms of Pakistan policy, I want to suggest, because you know the Afghan is the international issue.
Excuse me, ma'am.
But in Pakistan,
I'm sorry, if
yes,
you
I'm
could,
just concluding.
Yeah, a question is what is asked.
Yes, my question is, what about taking this issue from this conference for the refugee convention? Because we have seen we are dealing Afghans with the Pakistan government relation with Taliban. Why not we raise this question of Pakistan adopting refugee convention and dealing whether Afghan or Rohingya with the same refugee convention on with the objectivity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll take a couple more questions. And please, could there be questions in short? Sir. Okay, go ahead. And then you'll be next. Yeah.
This is Zulkarnain Asghar. I'm working for the well-being of person living with disabilities, person with disabilities. And I have one question. How do you see, as a panelist, Taliban have expansionist mindset and subordination of women? That is in their core philosophy. First part of the question: how world can tackle their philosophy to ensure that they can provide the rights of all citizens, vulnerable communities. First part of the question. Second part of the question is, these Islamist or these right-wing people, they use negotiation and democratic processes as a ladder, and later on they burn that ladder behind them. How do you deal with them? Because they are not reliable and they won't be reliable. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question. उर्दू में बोलें, अंग्रेजी में बोलें, जो भी आप पीछे थे, आप मैं एक दो और questions लेके then I'll open it up.
My name is Junaid Sattar.
Questions, and please keep them short.
An advocate from AJK. My question is that do we fail to engage effectively with the Taliban by condemning their present actions while overlooking their historical roots, ideological evolutions, and missed chances for structured legal and political engagement? And same situation is going to be happened in the AJK and other areas of administrative by the Pakistan government. Thank you.
Somebody at the back first.
Human rights work doesn't have boundaries. So in Pakistan, even they are involved in safe and peaceful activities. But the government of Pakistan is, for the last year, they are not allowing them to be staying legal because their visas are expired and there is no support from the government to extend their visas. Even they had to pay a large amount of money to get the visas. And I think at the moment that is a very good opportunity for our federal government to assist and support these women. So in near future, they can be a ray for peace and democracy and human rights. Thank
That's
you.
a very good question.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for an extremely informative session. I just had a question about the idea of principled engagement. I remember this was a term that was brought up, and I was wondering how this can be effective diplomacy given all that Ms. Koofi brought up about how the situation of women and girls won't change until the political climate changes. So I was wondering, in terms of principled engagement, with whom would the most effective engagement be, and what would the aims of such engagement be?
Thank you very much. Around.
Maybe I'll just have a go at two of them rather than try all. One, there's a lot of interest, I think, in the treatment of Afghan refugees, and Minister Kayani, you may not know, but I spoke yesterday, and I spoke quite a lot on this issue. I want to start from the point of view that there needs to be responsibility sharing, and I think you will agree with that. I would be surprised if you don't. We need to see other countries taking more responsibility for Afghan refugees in Pakistan, and actually in other countries too, particularly Iran. This could be done either by taking some refugees themselves, or by finding ways to support Pakistan here in supporting the refugees. Afghanistan, as I said yesterday, is not a safe country for return for large numbers of Afghans, particular categories, women and girls, journalists, members of the previous government, especially the security forces. It's not safe. And there are international human rights treaties as well as international customary law that apply in addition to refugee law on this. In my view, there ought to be acknowledging Pakistan's history of support and hospitality. I think what has happened is that the refugees have become pawns in a political game. I see it as cruel, and many of them contact me in desperate fear and situations, and genuine situations. At the very least, two things I recommend. One is more engagement on this from other countries abroad, as I mentioned, and secondly, a screening program. If the policy can't be reversed, then at least a screening program that can protect those that are most vulnerable. I've discussed this with UNHCR. They're in favor of it. They say it's manageable, that the UNHCR with the government could do this, and by doing it could save lives. On the question of principled engagement, I talked about that a little bit before. And I think it means just a couple of examples would be, when engaging with the Taliban, don't normalize their unacceptable behavior. And whatever the meeting is about, make it clear your position on what's unacceptable and what's expected in terms of human rights. And in particular, ensure that if international community is engaging, that they engage with women, that I'd like to see women's leadership among the international community in that engagement. I have a whole lot more I could say, but time is short. Thank you.
So the relationship between Afghanistan and Pakistan have been basically influenced by 5 decades of war. And the narrative in that 5 decades of war has not really been friendly. And in fact, I was one of those who was very critical of the Pakistan's policy towards Afghanistan. And I am still very critical of some of your policies. And if we have come to this realization that, it's time to fix some of our mistakes, this issue of trust building is the major major cornerstone, and refugee is one of those. I'm not asking for blanket accommodation of refugees, and it's not a major concern for now, but every time I come to Pakistan and I engage with thousands of those who actually had to flee their country and stay in Pakistan, it breaks my heart, because we come from the most beautiful country on earth, full of resources. Why should we actually seek refuge to another country? But the situation is made in a way that we are now refugees. Most of these people have came after 2021. They have been part of the progress of their society. Now they have to be in Pakistan. And I'm asking that there should be, as Richard said, that there should be, a categorization. We in fact submitted 5 categories of those that should be protected to the government of Pakistan. If you want to pressurize Taliban, sending the refugees who came to Pakistan after 2001 is not the way to pressurize Taliban, because Taliban will be very happy to host and receive these refugees, because they have fought with them. Some of these military generals who are in Islamabad and in Attack and in Peshawar and in Lahore, they were actually the ones who actually fought Taliban in their own way, either militarily or through their voice with journalism, etc. In the meantime, I think very briefly on this theocratic approach policy of Taliban, and how to engage with them, I think the international community now have reasons. First of all, they think we need to talk with Taliban because they will have to protect women's rights and human rights. But from my understanding, women's rights and human rights is the last part of their agenda when they engage with Taliban. There is a difference between expressing concerns and statement of condemnation to setting red lines. I think international community can engage and set red lines with the Taliban instead of expressing concerns. And those countries that are in the region and they use security as a pretext of engaging unconditionally with Taliban and in fact invest in Afghanistan, taking our minerals right and left, they should know that, the Taliban relationship with Pakistan is just an example. You're right. They are not reliable. So therefore, it has to be not only conditional, principle, but also it has to be based on, mutual accountability. These countries should be held accountable. Those countries that invest in Afghanistan, sign business partnership with Afghanistan, they should know that they have a small part of their society who believe the same way of the Taliban. What if those part of the society come to power and try to make their ideology a national policy of that government? How do they feel? So they should feel our pain. And they should know that we are victim of global, failure of diplomacy. They shouldn't make us further fail. We will find our way. Afghans will always find their way. I'm more hopeful today than I was before because there are many reasons that make me feel hopeful Afghanistan will change. But I hope countries who are in the region, who actually invest and have, used this situation, know that once we go to that point where we will have our country, reclaim our country, these countries will be held accountable for that, for their policies of no condition, no principle in their approach towards Afghanistan.
Thank you. Yeah, that was excellent. Patty, yes, we still have time for... No, then Minister, the last word is yours.
I'll just very briefly answer the question that was raised by the lady regarding the visa applications. So I'll just reiterate the overall stance, which is that I think the door isn't closed to Afghan citizens. It's just that Pakistan wants them to come through the documentation process and the visa process. And I think the particular case that you've mentioned about certain women, my understanding of the issue that she's raised is that they're already here and their visa, they have a visa extension application perhaps. So I cannot speak to that specifically but I would request her to share the details. And I'll definitely share the details with the relevant department, whether it's the Ministry of Interior, and we'll definitely revert to her with an outcome on that.
Samina, could I just jump in with an example, if I may? I'm very happy to hear from I think it's Ms. Luna from Food for Thought. When I came to Afghanistan, to Pakistan a few days ago, how much did my visa cost? $60. That's reasonable. I am hearing from Afghans who are paying $1,500 for a visa. So, Minister, why the discrepancy?
Minister is not in charge of the immigration department, but I do think that what he has just suggested was a very helpful way to address the issue, a case-specific case, and I think these are valid issues raised. And I'm sure this discussion should continue. But in the meantime, can we all please thank this panel for a wonderful discussion?
Thank you, Samina.
Thank you. They were great, all of you.